So we're looking at here at an individual who has a condition called vitiligo, of course. So when we start talking about the origin of the whites and their offspring and how they develop these melanin recessive characteristics, and some people will say, well, you know, it took them 20,000 years and so forth, or, you know, a number of different things. People are talking about Neanderthal DNA and things like that. People are really not studying. There were studies that came out that said most Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit people do not have any quote unquote Neanderthal DNA, and they're the only population on Earth who doesn't carry Neanderthal DNA, where all other non-Black populations have a certain percentage, 2%, 3%, 5% of Neanderthal DNA. So that made some people who really don't study jump to conclusions and say, well, you know, that white people are Neanderthals and our people are not, and Neanderthals are not the real humans and we are, and all this other nonsense. In reality, the quote unquote Neanderthal type began in Afuraitkaitnit, was jet black, just like the rest of us. This is just a different type of human being. They migrated into Southern Europe. Some of them got caught in the Ice Age, some of them did not. Some of the quote unquote Homo sapiens sapiens got caught in the Ice Age, and some of them did not. So originally, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the quote unquote Neanderthal type, and that's just a European term based on a cave in a region that they found the fossils initially, so they just named it that. But that type existed on the continent. We have basically four types. We have the tall, slender type as representative of, say, the Nuer people or Dinka people in East Afuraitkaitnit. You have the Bachwa people or Akha people, so-called pygmies and so forth. That's another type. You have the Bantu type, so-called Bantu type, which is the vast majority of Afuraitkaitnit people, like West Afuraitkaitnit people, West Africans, South Central Afuraitkaitnit people, Africans, and so forth. But then you also have the type that manifests with the robust brow ridges and marked prognathism and so forth, that are considered quote unquote Neanderthals. They survive within the population, and we'll just post this up right now, just so you can see. So the people in Papua New Guinea, as well as those who are Australian, quote unquote, Aborigines and so forth. And just so you can see a couple of images. So these are people from Papua New Guinea. Here's another image and so forth. So they have a different structure. They have been found to have some Denisovan DNA as well as Neanderthal DNA and so forth. These are the remnants of the Black, quote unquote, robust type, which the whites and offspring will call, you know, Neanderthals, but they're of course human beings. And just so you can see a image, Australian Aborigines. So these are Australian Aborigines and so forth. They have a different bone structure. Once again, the robust brow ridges mark prognathism that's a little bit slightly different than, you know, the Bantu type. So just like you have, you know, you have a hawk, falcon, but then you also have swans. You have white swans, black swans, and so forth, who have slender necks and so forth and different body shape. But then you have a hawk or a falcon or an eagle who have short necks and more powerful and more, you know, quote unquote, muscular, so to speak, as opposed to slender and sleek. We have different types as well. So those 4 different types, and they're really connected to the 4 children of Heru and so forth, and the 4 different cardinal points. And we're going to get into some of that a little bit later. But so when we look at an image such as the sister, vitiligo, it is an autoimmune disorder. So when there's a problem, the body stops producing proper amounts of melanin. It's not able to produce the proper amounts of melanin. So you see some, for example, the sister starts out, just a few white spots, but then it can take over the entire body. And within a number of years, all of the melanin can be stripped from the outside, externally. Now, of course, internally, she still has a ba'et, she has a ka'et, so she has a spirit, a ba'et, she has a soul, a ka'et, she's still an Afurakani, Afuraitkaitnit individual. Same is true with a sister who, externally is an albino, externally, no, eumelanin externally, but internally, proper stores of melanin. Internally, of course, she has a ba'et, the spirit, she has a ka'et, she has a soul, she is an Afuraitkaitnit woman. Same thing with the Afurakani male who's an albino. They're called Ufiri and Akhan, whether it's Akhan tradition, Yoruba tradition, and so forth. They are protected, have special protection by the Nsanampo, the spiritually cultivated ancestresses and ancestors because of their condition. Just like if you have a child that's born with a specific condition, you will protect them. You'll make sure that they don't get sick. You make sure they're protected from ultraviolet rays from the sun and so forth. You have protection if somebody tries to, ridicule them or attack them. The community will attack that individual. The same thing happens with the Nsanampo. They protect the Ofiri, the quote unquote albinos, because of their condition. So we have that as part of the culture. So we know who they are. We know where this white skin comes from, but also we know there's a difference between the white-skinned albino in the Afuraitkaitnit community or someone with vitiligo in comparison to the whites in our spring. Now, the other reason we show that is because people need to know how easily white skin can come about. Because some people would want to say, you even have fools talking about extraterrestrials and all kinds of stupidity about where white people come from, idiotic nonsense. But just with vitiligo alone, some of our people migrating and being drawn into northern Eurasia, getting caught up in the ice age and so forth, living in an area where there's a lack of proper sunlight. So they develop the autoimmune disorder, which is vitiligo, and strips them of their melanin and so forth. But there's another piece. If you engage in the perversity of incest, that greatly increases the incidence of albinism. So those who are engaged in perversity, sexual perversity, are the ones who are forced out of our populations in the first place. They were either killed or forced out. The majority of them were executed. So just like you have cancer cells that develop in your body, what happens to the cancerous cells? The immune system cells, lymphatic cells, isolate them and kill them. That happens every day, all day long. If you have a group of cells, you're going to have a tiny percentage, less than 1/100th of a percentage, that become cancerous at any given moment, but you have an immune system that takes care of it. In the world, Afuraitkaitnit body, the communal body, the black body, millions of people, there's a small percentage that become cancerous. They engage in behavior that is self-destructive. And the immune system cells within the community isolate those cancerous cells or individuals and destroy them. The priests, priestesses, warriors, warrioresses, and so forth isolate those individuals and destroy them. We've always done that. Just like the cancerous cells get destroyed in your body, it's always happened. The difference a few thousand years ago, over 12,000 years ago, and really going back 20,000+ years ago, is when some of those would escape that kind of destruction, that exile themselves from the community, Some did that, of course, in Afuraitkaitnit, but they would typically die out on the outskirts of the villages and so forth. Their children and grandchildren would later come back to the village and become reincorporated. That's been happening for thousands and thousands of years. Some of our people migrated into Southern Europe, into the Near East, into Asia, into Australia, even into North, Central, South America, you know, the Caribbean and so forth, as well as, you know, all around the world. The exact same process would happen. We're living, building culture and everything else, nonstop. But then when you have those cancerous cells develop, the ones who get executed, they get executed. The ones who can escape and exile themselves and move away from the communities and die out, you know, on the outskirts of the community, their children come back and so forth. That happened in Southern Europe, just like it happened in Afuraitkaitnit. But then you have some who isolated themselves and exiled themselves and went up into further into Northern Eurasia, but then they got caught up during the Ice Age and they weren't able to move around. After a number of years and so forth, centuries, millennia, there was a population of individuals who were inbreeding, producing a large percentage of albinos and so forth. But the key is they were engaged in self-destructive, perverse behavior, dissexuality, homosexuality, you know, inbreeding, incest, and so forth. That is perverse, self-destructive, that causes your crowd to separate from you. We're going to get into that a little bit later, but that's what defines them. Engaging in disorder behavior repels the soul, the divine consciousness, and now you're a spirit without a soul. So now internally, you're disfigured, externally, you're disfigured. Well, let's look at this human skin color piece. Now, we just wanted to touch on this piece right here. The genetic mutations, once again, mutations leading to light skin, though partially different among East Asians and Western Europeans, suggest the two groups experience similar selective pressure after settlement in northern latitudes. Now, it's really not selective pressure, but they say the theory is partially supported by a study into the SLC24A5 gene, which found that the allele associated with light skin in Europe determined that 18,000 years have passed since the light skin allele was fixed in Europeans, but may have originated as recently as 12,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago, given the imposition of method, which is in line with the earliest evidence of farming. Now, research by Nina Jablonski suggests that an estimated time of about 10,000 to 20,000 years is enough for human population to achieve optimal skin pigmentation in a particular geographic area, but that development of ideal skin coloration may happen faster if the evolutionary pressure is stronger, even in as little as 100 generations. They started talking about selective pressure, evolutionary pressure. Now they're editorializing about the science. The science itself, the SLC24A5 gene that's responsible for the switch from dark skin to melanin recessiveness, that's the switch. Yes, they migrate into different places, but in Northern Eurasia, that's where the switch came, through that particular gene. They'll say it may have originated as recently as 12,000 to 6,000 years ago. Now that means beyond 12,000 years ago, there were no white-skinned individuals, period. Let's go a little bit further. This is a more recent study, and people were sharing this a lot on social media. Early Britain had dark skin and light eyes, DNA analysis shows. Of course, they're still going to try to give them some straight hair, they can't let go of it. So they talk about in 1903, the remains of a 10,000-year-old man were discovered in the Cheddar Gorge of Somerset, England, dubbed the Cheddar Man and so forth. He died in his 20s, early 20s. The genome analysis was conducted by researchers at London's Natural History Museum, extracted DNA from Cheddar Man's inner ear bone, located at the base of the skull. And this is the most important piece. The new discovery suggests that light skin evolved in European populations much later than is commonly believed. Now, the results of Cheddar Man's genome analysis align with recent research that has uncovered the convoluted nature of the evolution of skin tone. First humans to leave Afuraitkaitnit, Africa 40,000 years ago, are believed to have had dark skin, which would have been advantageous in sunny climates. It's not advantageous, it's natural, it's normal. We were created with dark skin. That's the end of the creation of the human being. They start talking this nonsense about, well, this had an advantage and white skin has an advantage. That's foolishness. Now, then it says humans did not uniformly develop light skin when they reached the colder regions in Europe. They had to admit that basically when they got to Europe, all of a sudden everybody didn't become white, meaning there was no advantageous piece there. It was not an advantage to have light skin. We've been in, if you look at what they're actually saying and read between the lines, if we arrived in Europe 40,000 years ago, but light skin doesn't develop until no earlier than 12,000 years ago, that means we've been in Europe for tens of thousands of years with dark skin, meaning that just migrating to a colder climate in and of itself is not an advantage to have melanin recessive skin. We were living in Europe for tens of thousands of years with black skin. So that removes this whole notion of white people naturally evolved into being white. No, they degenerated. That's the key. Now, so it says in 2015, for example, a study of ancient DNA found that while individuals in Northern Europe had pale skin, hair, and eyes around 8,500 years ago, humans in the region of Spain, Luxembourg, and Hungary, closer to Southern Europe, had dark skin. Genes for light skin may have only become widespread in Britain around 6,000 years ago, when farmers from the Middle East migrated to the region and began to reproduce with indigenous populations. Who are the indigenous populations with dark skin in Southern Europe? The ones who've been there for 40,000 years. So what they're talking about is our people have been in Europe for 40,000 years. The indigenous population, there were no light-skinned people prior to 12,000 years ago. The entire population of Europe and the entire population on Earth was still black. And then there's some degeneration, and then you have these light-skinned individuals. So what they go into detail about here, they start talking about the, and you can read this article, blue eyes and gray eyes and so forth, which is also a degeneration, a lack of melanin. It's not some natural occurring, evolutionary expression to have gray eyes, blue eyes and or green eyes and so forth. That has to do with the level of melanin and how corrupt it has become. The lack of melanin shows, the lack of pigment, natural eye color, dark brown to black and so forth. Anything beyond that is a corruption. Now, so we're going to switch that off real quick. Now, just to give a little bit more context to that particular time frame, talked about over 12. The earliest the white skin manifests 12,000 years ago. So we'll look what was going on in Sudan at that same time. Nabta Playa and the ancient astronomers of the Nubian desert. Nabta Playa, and you'll see this is the stones in the form of a calendar and so forth, dealing with the solstices and equinoxes and so forth, properly placed. Nabta Playa is a remarkable site composed of hundreds of prehistoric tumuli, stelae, and megalithic structures located in the Nubian desert, approximately 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel in southern Egypt. Kemet, they are the result of an advanced urban community that arose approximately 11,000 years ago and left behind a huge assembly of stones. Now, some archaeologists believe that the people of Nabta Playa were the precursor civilization for the first Nile cities that arose in Kemet, Egypt, thousands of years later. So initially, when they started looking at the stones of Nabta Playa, they were talking about they were 15,000, 18,000 years ago, but then they changed the dates and moved it up to 11,000 years ago because they don't want our people to be as ancient as they are. But it goes beyond 11,000 years ago. Let's look at the prehistory of Kemet. Just to give a further corroboration of that. Now, when people talk about ancient Kemet, they often focus on the dynastic period. When you look at the papyrus of Turin, they talk about the Turin's kings list. And let's just touch on that real quick before we get into this. Okay, so in the Turin kings list found on the reverse of a papyrus tax roll, it lists many of the kings of Kemet, including a number of divinities. It was composed during the reign of Ramesu II by Theban scribes. So it presents the Theban political viewpoint. For example, it begins the 11th dynasty with the founders of Theban line rather than with the later reign of Mentuhotep II. But in the first column, it lists the divine dynasties, the dynasties of the deities. And they talk about the deities who were, rulers first, and then later the physical kings of Kemet. So they list these various kings and so forth. But there's one particular piece, let me pull up another version of that, talking about Kemet. Now, the total years of Egyptian history, according to its own documents, reaches back 36,620 years. The Papyrus of Turin provides a complete list of kings who reigned in Upper and Lower Egypt from Menes to the New Kingdom in the first column, and lists those who ruled before him in the second column. The last two lines are explicit. So in that Turin papyrus that we just showed, when they're looking at the reign of the deities, and then after the reign of the deities, the venerables of the Shemsu Heru, or the followers of Heru. And the last two lines, there's some damage, but then the last two lines are very explicit. It says the venerables of the Shemsu Heru, 13,420 years, reigns up to the Shemsu Heru, 23,200 years. So that becomes 36,620 years, up to the first dynasty. So the text of Kemet in the King's List, the Turin Papyrus, talks about before the first dynasty in Kemet, there were 36,620 years of rule of the deities, and then the venerables of Shemsu Heru, or the followers of Heru. And then the dynasty of the mortal kings and so forth. When we talk about the reign of the deities, just like you can go to a shrine of a priest or a priestess today, an Okomfo, for example, or Obosomfo and so forth. If you're getting divination, you could go before the individual, they could sit in front of the shrine, and then they get possessed by the Abosom. And once they get possessed by the Bosom speaks to you through the body of the person. That's spirit possession. So you're no longer speaking to the person, you're speaking to the Abosom that's has possessed the body of the individual. They can give you some advice, direction, and then eventually the spirit will leave the body and the person, takes over their own body once again. If the person gets possessed by the divinity and gives some directions for rulership for the community, we need to set up this kind of institution, we need to set up this kind of military structure and so forth. Then when people are inquiring to the king or the queen mother and so forth about what we should do, and they get possessed by a divinity, the declarations that come forward are coming from the divinity. So that is the rule of the deities. It's talking about spirit possession. Some people want to say, well, the deities, came to earth from outer space and they would walk around in physical bodies and then they went up into the heavens. That's not what we're talking about. That's when people don't know what they're talking about. We're talking about spirit possession, communicating directly with the divinities through the agency of the king and so forth, or the queen mother. That's what we're talking about. The 36,620 years of rulership from the divine dynasties and the, Shemsu Heru, the ancestresses and ancestors and so forth. And then the mortal kings come around, quote unquote, 4,200 BCE, about 6,000 years ago. So 36,000 prior to that, then quote unquote 4,200 BC. So we're talking about 42,000 years ago is when the dynasties began, where there was an institution of kingship, queen mothership that's established in the region of Kemet. It was established 42,000 years ago. This is what our people are saying. Particular screen, they're talking about the Turin Papyrus, respect 36,620 years. The last two lines are explicit. The venerables Shemsu Heru, 13,420 years. Reigns up to the Shemsu Heru, 23,200 years. So that combined is 36,620 years before the first dynasty. And the first dynasty in reality is about 6,200 years ago, about 4,200 BCE, so-called BCE. Even though the whites in our spring try to move it to 3,100 BCE because they want to make it co-equal with, Babylon, Sumer, and so forth. Then they try to make it white because they don't want ancient Kemet to be earlier than the Near East where the nonsensical Bible stories take place, but that's fraud. So 36,000 years plus, then you go before 4,200 BCE. Up until now, that's a period of 42,000 years of kingship, queenship in ancient Kemet. Now, switch over. This is the Prehistoric Egypt page on Wikipedia and so forth. So if you go to the Paleolithic, excavation of the Nile has exposed early stone tools from the last millions or so years. The earliest of these lithic industries were located in a 30-meter terrace, primitive Acheulean, Abevilian, 600,000 years ago. But we want to look at the Hormusan industry. And you'll see that the Hormusan industry in Egypt and Kemet began 42,000, between 42,000 and 32,000 years before present. Kwamusans developed tools not only from stone, but also from animal bones and hematite. They also developed small arrowheads resembling those of Native Americans, but no bows have been found. The end of the Kwamusan industry came around 16,000 BC with the appearance of other cultures in the region, including the Gamayan and so forth. But what they're talking about, and in fact, even before that, if you look at the Wadi Halfa culture, some of the oldest known structures were discovered in Kemet by archaeologists Kim Lewuski, or whatever the name is, along the southern border near Wadi Halfa, Sudan, today's Sudan and so forth, at the Akhan 8 site. The structures were dated to 100,000 BC. The remains of the structures are oval depressions, about 30 centimeters deep and 2 by 1 meters across. Many are lined with flat sandstone slabs. So they're oval depressions. They're lined with flat sandstone slabs. They are called tent rings because the rocks supported a dome-like shelter of skins or brush. This type of dwelling provided a place to live, but if necessary, could be taken down easily and moved. They were mobile structures, easily disassembled, moved, and reassembled, providing, they'll say, hunter-gatherers with semi-permanent habitation. So we made flat stone slabs. We used, skins as well as brush, natural occurring, foliage and so forth to create a dome structure with the base of a sandstone slab to create a home. That's over 100,000 years ago. Then the Kwamusan industry, when they start having, arrowheads and things like that that are more well developed and so forth, made with animal bones as well as hematite and things like that, that's 42,000 years ago. So they'll throw in things like hunter-gatherers and things like that to make it sound primitive. But just like people build huts in, Afuraitkaitnit today that are using the materials in the area, which is natural, which is harmonious. And now when you talk about eco, development, and people are using natural, fibers and things like that to create natural eco homes, and people are all excited about that and seeing how cool this is because they're using, natural occurring fibers and plants and things like that in nature to create these homes that are energy efficient and in harmony with the environment and not creating pollution. We've always done that. So when they talk about 42,000 years ago, the Kwamusan, quote unquote, Kwamusan industry, and that's just a name that they use, our people were already building these. We had been building the sandstone slabs with the dome structures for the homes over 100,000 years ago. So 60,000 years later, we're still at 42,000 years ago, we're still developing, establishing a culture and so forth. That's in alignment with the establishment of the kingship and queenship 42,000 years ago, as noted in the Turin papyrus. So we just go through that information to show that not only did our people give a date with regard to where we were in Kemet 42,000 years ago, establishing a kingship, queenship, then the archaeology shows that we were already advanced culture. Most people today, if somebody went out into a forest today and you said, hey, look around, build yourself a home. You know how to use technology, we're quote unquote modern and so forth. The average male or female would not know how to create a sandstone slab and create a dome structure and make, tools that they can use, and also poisons and so forth to kill animals, that they put poisons on the arrows. They wouldn't know what plants were poisonous, what plants were nourishing. They wouldn't know how to make medicine. They wouldn't know how to move in that environment. They wouldn't know how to live in harmony in that environment, no matter how technologically advanced this quote unquote civil or society is. The average male and female would not be able to do that. So our people were doing that over 100,000 years ago. So what we're saying is, of course, even going back to 42,000 years ago, we were already civilized, established a civilized society, replicating divine order in the structure of society. the White's Narrow Spring didn't exist yet. You can go back to 15,000 years ago, Nabta Playa, when we're setting up these stones, the astronomical, calendar. White-skinned people did not exist yet when we were already establishing the calendar. And once again, they talk about here, Nabta Playa. And it's talking about the astronomical stones, the calendar cycle, marking out the solstices and equinoxes. So we were already civilized, knowing what we were doing before the White's Narrow Spring existed.